Welcome to class. One of the biggest jobs that the president has as leader of the executive branch and leader of the most powerful country in the world is foreign policy. This means the president is responsible for working with other countries around the world to try to make sure that American goals are being met and to try and assist other countries in the projects that they want to do that are consistent with what the United States wants to see happen. Foreign policy is complicated. It's not always easy. You have to remember that even though the president has a lot of power as the leader of the United States, each nation in the world is sovereign. In other words, each nation has its own leadership structure, its own system of governance, and there's not any reason why a nation should have to listen to another nation if they can't be persuaded to do so. So each nation is free to make its own choices, just like each citizen of our nation is free to make their own choices. And the president's role in foreign policy is therefore a combination of working with other countries in building alliances and putting pressure on countries that we have concerns about in a variety of ways. And we're going to look today both at the process of how foreign policy and diplomacy is handled and at the different tools that the president might use in conducting that foreign policy. I use the word diplomacy because diplomacy refers to the way that we actually engage in negotiations with other countries. A diplomat is someone who works across the border with people and tries to do so in a way that is going to lead to agreement and productive conversation. So when we say someone is being diplomatic, we might mean that they're being polite or that they are trying not to offend the other, because it's important that we not get in fights around the world that we don't need to be in. So I've drawn the United States here with a bunch of arrows and people heading out to different parts of the world. Just about every nation in the world has an American embassy or a place where America has a representative in that country. Just like we welcome in Washington, D.C. Embassies and representatives from all other nations in the world. There are just a few countries with which we don't have diplomatic relationships. Countries like North Korea, for example, that we have serious disagreements with. So the name of someone who serves in that diplomatic mission as part of the State Department under the Secretary of State would be an ambassador. Ambassadors are selected by the president. They are confirmed by the Senate. And ambassadors work in the countries where they are assigned to bring back information and understanding about what's happening in that country so that the president can make better informed decisions about how to proceed with that country. The ambassador also takes American goals and interests to that country and tries to work with leaders in that country to meet American objectives. There are several goals in American foreign policy. The first goal is to protect American national security. National security has to do with keeping the country safe, making sure that our borders are secure, that there are no threats coming from these countries. So we want to maintain the absence of war, which is not the same as peace, I would say. Peace has to do more with a positive relationship with nations working together. But national security and safety is probably the first goal of foreign policy in the minds of most people. A second major goal of the president in foreign policy is economic expansion and economic growth. The president wants to build relationships with other nations that are going to lead to good economic opportunities for American companies working abroad, and will strengthen both the global and the national economy. We live in a world today that is interconnected. The economy in China is connected directly to the economy in the United States. If the Chinese economy is struggling, our economy is going to struggle. So it's important that we maintain positive and strong economic relationships around the world. The way that we do that, though, is debatable. Some argue that we should have free trade agreement and no limitations on trade with most countries in the world. Others say that free trade agreements are damaging to workers in the United States because American jobs get shipped overseas, and damaging to the environment because we have environmental standards in this country when it comes to factory production that simply don't exist in some parts of the world. And companies often go and build a factory in a place that has few labor standards and few environmental standards because it's less expensive for the company to produce there. But economic growth and benefits for the American economy are a major factor in foreign policy, particularly when it comes to energy security. Oil is very important to the United States' strategic interest, and so that's why the Middle East is a region where the United States has expended so much time and energy and money sending our military there in the Iraq War, being concerned about what's happening in Iran and Afghanistan. Although Afghanistan is not an oil-producing country, it's an important area in the Middle East that is of strategic interest to the United States with regard to oil. If we lose access to that oil coming from the Middle East, we lose access to our main power source, and our economy would really struggle. That's why it's been a major initiative of Barack Obama and others to move towards more green energies. If we can move towards wind and solar power, then we're going to be able to move away from a dependence on foreign oil that ties us to countries that have authoritarian governments. Even allies like Saudi Arabia have very authoritarian governments that are not liberal at all. Women have very few rights in Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is viewed as one of our closest allies or friends in the Middle East. Moving now to democracy and human rights. This is another goal of American foreign policy. We do tend to want to expand democratic governance and protect human rights around the world. This is a reason why we got involved in Kosovo under President Clinton. We got into military conflict trying to end ethnic cleansing there. Although there are always criticisms. Why did we get involved in Kosovo but not get involved later in places like Rwanda? So there's a complicated discussion. Should we send American troops to places to protect human rights, even if economic objectives would not be met by getting involved there? Some, in fact, a great many people believe that if there's not an economic or national security interest there, it's not our business and we should stay out of it. Others feel that no, if we know that human rights are being violated, that people are being killed or deprived of basic human rights like life, liberty, and property, then the United States does have a responsibility to get involved. That's an interesting question that you should think about for yourself and think about what your view on that is. So we know now we have these goals in foreign policy: national security, economic growth, and democracy and human rights. Next question is, how do we accomplish these goals? One of the main things that we do to achieve our foreign policy goals is we use economic means. So these can be, I've put a plus and a minus sign, because we can use carrots or positive incentives for countries to work with us, or we can punish countries economically if they're not meeting the goals of our foreign policy. Let me give you an example of each. After World War II, Europe had been decimated. The infrastructure was destroyed, major damage to the cities throughout Europe, especially in France, but in other places as well, in Eastern Europe. So one thing that the United States did in order to build strong ties to these European countries and hopefully get them to be very friendly to American economic goals is a plan created by George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State, which was, we are going to extend foreign aid. We're going to give money to these countries so that they can do their rebuilding process. And if the countries grow accustomed to receiving aid from the United States, they're going to want to do what we want them to do, because they're going to be afraid if they don't do what we want them to do, they're going to lose the money. So we provide foreign aid to a lot of different nations. You could think of it as a sort of bribery, but it is a bribery that benefits American interests in some cases. With regard to trade, we also set up free trade zones. We have a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. President Obama has worked to expand trade with Asia in particular and South America. But we also use trade as a punishment. We had economic sanctions or an embargo against Cuba, and we've had that in place for many, many years. For a period of time, we had that kind of a sanctions policy where we would not allow Americans to travel to, we would not allow American businesses to trade with or sell anything to Cuba or to Iraq, North Korea. These are nations that we do not conduct business with. And the idea is, if we're not conducting business with you, you can't make as much money. And the United States works with other allies to make these embargoes more effective. An embargo is when you refuse to trade. You isolate a country from the rest of the world economy, and that country has to do basically everything on their own. So if a nation is the subject of an embargo, it becomes very difficult for that country to get new products, and it's hard for the country to produce everything that they need. So those countries that are under embargoes sometimes suffer great poverty among the people. There are debates about whether those embargoes are effective, because often the leaders are still doing quite well, but they do face pressure sometimes from unhappy people within their countries if the embargo remains in place for a long time. Let's take a look now at alliances. We create relationships, positive relationships with countries based on any one of these things. We might have an alliance that's based on security. An example of that would be NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. That's a group of nations that have agreed that if one of them is attacked, all of them will come to their defense. So France, Germany, the United States, Canada, there are many countries now that are members of NATO, and if one of those countries is attacked by another country, there is a treaty requirement that we will go to their defense. So that's one thing that we do. And then I talked a moment ago about foreign aid. Egypt right now is in a state of chaos, and there's a question about whether the United States is going to cut off aid to Egypt because of the unrest and the violence that is taking place within Egypt and the lack of leadership that we've seen. Israel receives a lot of American foreign aid, and there's a debate over whether we should continue to provide that aid to Israel, even though Israel has taken steps to undermine the human rights and the dignity of the Palestinian population within Israel. At the same time, the argument is that Israel is the country within the Middle East with whom we have the most in common in many regards, with regard to politics and with regard to the way that Israel is a secular or a non-religious state, at least officially. Although Israel is dominated by people who are Jewish, officially it's a secular state in an area where every other nation just about is a Muslim state. Now, some of those Muslim states are also nominally secular or officially secular democracies, so it gets very complicated when we get into Middle East politics. And then finally, we also, of course, have at our disposal the most powerful military in the world. Our military receives more funding than I think the next 10 or 15 or 20 countries in the world spend on military combined. So the American military is the most well-funded, the most well-trained, and the most powerful in the world. Our Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines are at the command of the President, and it's an extremely powerful deterrent to countries who might think about going against us, because they know that if the United States does send in its military, it's very unlikely that we would lose. Now, there have been cases where we have had very challenging circumstances, like in Iraq, Many people say that we didn't really win very much in Iraq with our involvement there, just like we didn't win very much in Vietnam in the 1970s and 60s. And there are clear questions about what's happened in Afghanistan and how effective we have been in the long run with our involvement in Afghanistan. But if you're talking about a purely military or strategic objective, the military has been very effective. The problems that we've faced in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Vietnam were more political problems that come back to a need for diplomacy and working with people than they were military problems. All right, that's foreign policy in a nutshell. Obviously, we can talk for months about foreign policy, but hopefully this gives you some sense, and we'll talk more about it in class.